Like, literally scared to death?
So cool.
I loved Afterlife. It was really magical. It felt like, you got the team back together. When I reflect back on my original exposure to Ghostbusters as a kid, and I think you and Jason Reitman and myself were kind of that similar generation. As a kid, this wasn't really a family movie. In fact, it was the movie that I remember kind of poking my head around the corner and watching as my older siblings were watching it, and legitimately scary moments as well as jokes that were perhaps a little bit older than what I was supposed to be engaging with. So when did it evolve into this family franchise? Was it the toy line, the Ecto Cooler, the Real Ghostbusters animated series, and talk about the evolution
Well, look,
into
yeah,
family.
you're absolutely right. I have the exact same relationship with it. I saw the first Ghostbusters film as a kid, like you. I was way too young to see it, but it totally got me, like hook, line, and sinker. I loved its tone, and I felt like its tone spoke to me, even though I didn't understand all the jokes. And it scared me too. I mean, I remember the experience of seeing it in a movie theater and feeling really terrified and loving every second of it. But it also it did very quickly tap into a larger cultural moment. And I think that was a shift that maybe maybe even took the original game by surprise, that it was something that felt accessible by a wide audience. And so there's a reason that so many products came out. The song became, a #1 hit. There was a cereal, there were toys that came out, there were, branded outfits, all that stuff sort of exploded out from that movie because I think people saw in Ghostbusters something really unique. It was a story that had all the trappings of kind of massive good and evil, like superhero or super character stories, but that actually in this instance asked a group of ordinary folks to be the ones doing the world saving. And I think that felt really fresh. I think that also the tone was extraordinarily brave and unique for that first film, because it did create a kind of genre blending in a way that just was not part of the film language in a blockbuster film. So there was something in the water. It definitely was something that I thought about in directing this film, was tapping into the same experience I had watching the first film for the first time, and remembering that there was a sort of danger that the film could communicate, a sense that maybe the ground under you wasn't so stable. And that's something that we don't really do enough for young audiences or general audiences even. A lot of time we sort of compartmentalize these things. So the genre exists for older audiences, or dangerous moments, or moments of suspense, or supernatural thrills are not really offered up to a 4-quadrant audience, and that just feels lame. Like, I think we could do
Yeah.
better. So we set out to do that in writing this film, and I certainly set out to do that as a director.
In addition to being a journalist, I'm also like a big paranormal nerd and researcher and do a lot of paranormal TV. So Ghostbusters was something that directly, and Dan Aykroyd influenced me to this
That
spooky.
makes me so happy. Oh, amazing. Cool. My pin is on my other jacket, but I wear
Yeah,
a Ray's pin on
yeah.
almost every jacket I have.
It's so when you introduce a villain, we have, Zool, of course, is iconic, and then we had Vigo, but we kind of I think it made sense to bring Zool back for Afterlife, but when you introduce a new threat, sorry, Gozer, and when you're
Yeah.
introducing a new threat in this film, talk about the origins of this baddie. And it'll be a few days before we post this, so I think we're still safe. But talk about the origins of this baddie and how you kind of go as big or bigger than Gozer.
Well, the stakes we're always going to come up with this film. We knew that that Afterlife was a film that had to complete the story of the of Egon's unfinished business. And that had to happen through his descendants as a way of a literal passing of the wand. But that on this next story, there was a wide open canvas to go really lethal with our antagonist. That meant both mining a new mythology. So Jason and I had the greatest time researching in order to build up the story of Garraka. We wrote a lot in London, where I'm living mostly now, and we a part of our process was going through, you know, the British Museum to their Hall of Antiquities and just feeling the charge of ancient objects and the stories that they can hold. That felt like such a great starting point for creating a villain that has a story, a tragedy, a bass note at the center of them, but that is evil and driven, and that their goal will lead to the destruction of life as we know it, at least in this city, but probably in the world writ large. And so, you know, you don't get many opportunities in this world to create a Ghostbuster villain. I took that role on with relish. I've been drawing monsters and creatures in the margins of my pages since I was probably 6 years old. All of my math textbooks, science textbooks throughout middle school and high school are basically, you know, panopticons and like just full of multi-eyed horned creatures with long fingernails. So I was born to bring Garraka to the screen, and I drew the character of Garraka while we were writing this script, and that drawing was the template for the character that you met in the film.
There is sort of like with Gozer, there's a verisimilitude with it that you could believe that there's this cult operating in New York and literally imbued in the beams, the steel beams of a building. And but Garaka kind of has that feel as well with this ancient entity, you know, Babylonian, Sumerian with a smidge of Lovecraftian kind of vibes in there. Is there any in your research that you said that you took a trip to the British Museum, was there anything that you saw that was like, okay, that's a piece of Garraka, that's a piece of Garraka? What were sort of the core things you were pulling?
Well, one of the things that was really interesting was the early metalwork that we encountered on those trips, and thinking about the sort of special material properties. There was a few things that were cool about that. One is we were already thinking about the power of objects to contain spirits or stories in them, and then how, you know, just like artifacts can survive thousands of years and today be discovered, studied, maybe misused, that there were specific elements, you know, copper, brass, that could have been discovered to hold special supernatural conducting properties. And that was an early excitement for us in these research trips, because it suggested not just a connection to a larger historical story, which feels just cool as a bit of storytelling, but also that it felt somehow uniquely connected to Ghostbusters, which has such a tactile sense. You know, these proton packs, part of the reason that they have become such iconic props in these stories is not just that they're like really fucking cool, but also that they feel like something as an audience member you can interact with. You can sort of imagine the weight of it on your back. You can imagine the kind of chipped enamel or metal work, the twisted wires that are snaking out and ribbons from the back of the thing, the cyclotron kind of whirring and creaking. These things are all really visceral, and so it was definitely that was like a thrill for us when we started to lean in that direction. And it's so cool the way that Phoebe picks up on that. She understands that there are elements that these ancient primitive ghost busting outfits use that could maybe lead her down a path that would create a tool that might stand a chance against Garraka.
Even though the original film was imbued with sort of the family background, Dan Aykroyd's family background, the main rule I think we kind of got away from that, or we took away from that, was,
Yeah.
don't cross the streams until you do, right? But what did you and Jason find yourself creating sort of ghost rules? Like, now that this is hopefully extending and has extended, are you kind of building in rules of how your ghosts operate, how your entities operate, and the laws they have to follow?
It's a really good question, and the answer surprises me still to this day. First, I'll say that we definitely do believe in internal rules for each ghost, because that you need to understand at least some basic concept of how they function, how they move, whether they can travel through walls. These sort of things are really, really important, just to be able to believe that they can all sort of exist in the same world that we do. But in answer to your primary question, one of the lessons that the first Ghostbusters offered up is that this is a really liberal ecosystem of the supernatural. And I particularly love that. It suggests that in the same film, within about 15 minutes, you can have a character like the librarian ghost in that first film, who is a human, elegant, soulful, but terrifying spirit. And you can then meet something like Slimer, which is a free-floating, ridiculous, free-floating spirit. And I loved that, the sort of expansiveness of that. It's just so welcoming to the idea that in the Ghostbusters world of storytelling, there is no one set definition for what a ghost can be, not one set of a rule book.
Yeah. And again, I think probably a generational thing. I remember, I could still distinctly remember watching the Mysteries of the Unknown commercials, like, picture, like, explain this. A woman in her house gets a
This
phone
woman was
call.
sitting in her chair when she
Sitting in her chair.
spontaneously combusted.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I that kind of really segues into the question of your own ghost story. I'm sure you're getting this a lot, but what's your own spooky story, ghost story, strange and unusual tale?
I've had a few. I'm going to tell you one that I haven't told before, because I actually do have a few experiences. I think any of us who are open to this is probably because we've been sensitive to it throughout our lifetimes. And I'll tell you my first encounter, because it's a really interesting, for me, one. It's a personal one. But I can remember every single second of this experience. It happened when I was very young. I was staying at my grandparents' house, and I was sleeping, and I woke up because I felt something banging against my face. And when I opened my eyes, I saw the ceiling. And I turned and looked down and saw myself on the bed sleeping. And I started to drift away from myself down a set of stairs to the living room area. And it was a sort of half light, very dim, the kind of light that you see at the very last seconds of the day before it goes completely dark. And there was a sliding glass door that led to the garden, and that door was wide open. And there were white curtains that were sort of billowing into the room. And that's when I realized that there were some figures standing there at the doorway. And as I drifted closer, I wasn't walking on the ground, I was floating in the air. As I drifted closer, I realized that they were my, deceased relatives. There were four of them, two closer than the other. And it was never frightening. I never felt like I was in danger. I didn't feel like I was close to death, but it did feel like a moment where there was some connection to folks that were no longer in the land of the living. And it was one that stayed with me. And I do feel like if there is any sort of authenticity to the emotional sensitivity to ghosts in this film, and I hope that some of that comes through to the audience with Melody, it was sort of born in that moment for me.
It's a great story, and it's one I've heard before in a very similar fashion, which does not invalidate it. In fact, if anything, to me, it kind of
Yeah.
corroborates the experience. And from the sort of the journalistic standpoint, I love collecting those stories, especially people that work in law enforcement or hospitals or whatever, when they're experiencing these things uh, over and over again, but also how it kind of can take a turn to the dark side. Like it can be heartening or it can be very dark.